I wanted to start my next video on Ancel Keys, the father of scientific plant-based eating. So Ancel Keys, PhD, died at the age of 100, which is important to know, okay, because that shows that he knows what he was talking about. The chances of living to 100 are not that great unless you know what you're talking about, generally speaking, especially considering Ancel Keys was a scientist that studied how to eat to live to 100. That should say something. So on November 20th at his home in Minneapolis, he is survived by his wife of over 65 years, Margaret Haney Keys, daughter Carrie DeAndrea of Bloomington, Minnesota, and son Henry Keys of Voorhees, son-in-law Harvey McLean, 8 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. He was predeceased by his youngest daughter, Martha Keys. Dr. Keys was born in Colorado Springs to Carrie Cheney Keys, sister of silent screen actor Lon Chaney, and Benjamin Keys, and raised in San Francisco Bay Area. He graduated from University of California at Berkeley and received PhD degrees from the University of California and Cambridge University in 1930 and 1938, respectively. After faculty appointments at Harvard and Mayo Clinic, he moved to the University of Minnesota, where he founded the Laboratory of Physiological Hygiene. He was the founder of a new field of quantitative human biology, combining research in physiology, nutrition, and epidemiology. So basically, he is the one that created the means of studying centenarian populations. Commissioned by the government in World War II to study performance during stress and nutritional deficiency, he developed the emergency K ration, K for Keys, that was used extensively by U.S. troops during the war and afterward. His pioneering research on semi-starvation culmination in a classic 2-volume monograph, The Biology of Human Starvation. He was the first to develop a method to predict the effect of diet changes on blood cholesterol of individuals and populations, and was the originator of the so-called cholesterol hypothesis of coronary heart disease. After his picture appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 1961, he was dubbed Mr. Cholesterol by the popular press. He was one of the founders of the then new field of cardiovascular disease epidemiology and trained a large cadre of young scientists and physicians from all over the world. He became a leading social force, organizing international experts into scientific councils that importantly influenced National Institute of Health and World Health Organization research policy and direction on the prevention of heart attack and stroke. His work had a major impact on thinking of medical profession, of the medical profession and the scientific community. What I want people to understand, a lot of people state that Seventh-day Adventism, which did have a large role in the formation of our current views on health, was responsible for our modern views on heart disease, and it was to a large extent. However, the science behind these things not only started with Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, but also hard scientists, okay, such as Dr. Ancel Keys. People that do not believe Ancel Keys is a scientist are crazy. He has had a great influence on the public's food choices and eating patterns, particularly with the cookbooks he wrote with his wife, Margaret, Eat Well and Stay Well, on the New York Times bestseller list for many months in 1960. He championed the Mediterranean diet for its health benefits. He retired from the university at age 68, as was mandated at the time. He continued to work on his research in Minneapolis and at their home in Italy, and published many important papers in his later years. His last paper, Longevity and Body Size of Men in Middle Age, 25-year Survival in the 7-Country Study, was published in March 2000 when he was 96 years of age. Okay, he received numerous honors, awards, and honorary degrees from around the world. He was a top candidate for a Nobel Prize, but that honor eluded him. The University of Minnesota held the first International Ancel Keys Symposium on Nutrition and Health, September 12th to 13th, 2004 in Minneapolis, focusing on the international obesity epidemic. Ancel and Margaret Keys were able to attend the opening session of the symposium. The Keys family requests that in lieu of flowers, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Ancel Keys is less well known for the railroad cohort. Okay, the U.S. railroad cohort differed from the others of the seven countries studies as an industrial worker cohort study initiated the year before the main seven countries studies. With its survey methods applied to the international cohorts, the U.S. cohort consisted of men in the rail industry working along rail lines, covering the northwest quadrant of the U.S. and representing occupations of contrasting work activity. So I'm going to take a look. This is my Ancel Keys playlist. So I want to take a look at some of the things that Ancel Keys said, starting with a brief history of Mr. Keys and a brief profile of Mr. Keys, and then go down. Okay, let's begin. So this is from somebody calling themselves Low Carb for Life. So I'm assuming this is probably not going to be the most... They're going to try and make him look terrible, I would think. But let's see if they do interfere with this. I doubt it, because I did put this in my playlist. But let's see. Let's take a look here. Okay.
Assistant Secretary to the Secretary of War at that time, and I was relieved of my duties, but I was reading in the newspapers about what seemed to be a new epidemic of coronary heart disease.
What is your name, please?
My name is Dr. Ancel Keys. Still like apples as much as ever?
Haven't got one in your pocket, have you, Doctor?
See you again next year. Next year.
We hope.
Now, this is the businessman research, which I'm assuming is what he goes over in this video. I haven't watched this video in quite a while.
Yeah, that it might be a good idea to follow some healthy executive men and see which ones would develop the disease. Well, it wasn't very long before it appeared that there was some connection between coronary heart disease and cholesterol in the blood. And so we started experiments in a manicomio on the diet and found that there was an important connection between the fats in the diet, particularly the kinds of fats in the diet, and cholesterol in the blood.
I, Dr. Ancel Keys, am a physiologist. My specialty is diet and health. I have written several books on the subject, including the current bestseller, Eat Well and Stay Well. I am presently engaged in a major experiment involving the health and eating habits of some 10,000 individuals scattered throughout the world. We are collecting data on all types, from African tribesmen to American businessmen. I have already had considerable effect on the diet of millions of Americans. I am the man who invented the K rations of World War II. The K stands for Keys. Signed, Dr. Ancel Keys.
Well, I had all these ideas in mind when we were in Oxford. I was a visiting professor at Oxford University for a year, and invited to be a chairman of a first meeting of the Food and Agriculture Committee on Nutrition in Rome. When I got down there, everybody was talking about food deficiencies, and I said, well, let's talk about the question of coronary heart disease.
Now, this is interesting. Notice how he says everybody was talking about food deficiencies. This is very similar to what happened to T. Colin Campbell and the China study. People were talking about protein deficiencies, and what he discovered is these people that were living on these low animal food diets were actually healthier than people that were gorging themselves on the Western diet, which led to the research that ended up as the China study, which might be the next That might actually be the next series of videos I do, is the China study.
They said, well, there's no problem. Gino Bergami, professor of physiology, says, no problem in Naples. We went back to Oxford, and after a while, it was cold, and I had an invitation to go down and look for myself what was the situation in Naples. We did find that in Naples, the common people, there was practically no coronary heart disease. You'd have to go to the rich people, the private hospitals, to find any. And we found also at the same time there was a great difference in the diet. I was taken to a dinner at the Rotary Club there and saw how the rich people ate, and then I saw how the poor people were eating, and there was an important connection there, I thought.
What are lipids?
Lipids are fats and things that are dissolved in fat solvents.
So the idea of making an examination of whole population came to me. We couldn't depend on just a few observations like that. So while we were in Naples, we looked around the countryside. Thought it'd be nice to buy a little property and have a picnic ground or something like that. And so with Flaminio, we came down. Do you remember?
Yes, sir.
We came down here and bought some property. And we saw something about the way people live here, at that time anyway. And we thought it would be a good idea to describe what we thought was the good Mediterranean diet of the people who obviously had very little problem of coronary heart disease. And so Margaret and I got busy and wrote a book. And the book was very popular. And Dr. Cadenza's wife translated into Italian, and Dr. Carbonin's wife translated into Finnish, and various other people translated into Japanese and German and Spanish and so on.
Dr. Keyes, number one, there are many things before K-rations that were used as a concentrate of food. What is pemmican?
There are very many kinds of pemmican. Pemmican is basically a dehydrated meat together with fats and sometimes parched grains used by American Indians and all the way up to the Arctic.
Well, that was the beginning of the whole idea of populations observing the diet and perhaps attempting to do something like the diet that we saw around here, which at that time was almost vegetarian. They had fish, more fish then than now, and so that convinced us that we should make a study in other places as well.
It was actually less fish then than now. He corrects that later. But if you look at the original diet, they actually ate less fish then than now. And he'll correct that. The reason why probably was because people that lived further away from the shoreline had difficulty getting the fish, especially if they were poor. That's my guess. I don't know for sure, but I do know in modern studies of the Mediterranean, that has been a theme, that people that live more inland don't really eat that much fish because they can't get to it, if you know what I mean.
We went from here to a trial in real south of Italy, in the Cartera, and then from there to the island of Crete, and began the systematic study of the populations in Europe and then also in Japan.
The facts are simple. You know the chief killer of Americans is cardiovascular disease, disorders and degeneration of the heart and blood vessels. Here are vital statistics. They show that this problem here in America is the worst in the world.
I guess I'm in. When do we eat? Well, what's your hurry? All you get now is beans. Army food is no longer a matter of beans and guesswork. Since the last war, nutrition has become a science. And our Army Quartermaster Corps uses that science in planning Army meals. Food correctly used means fighting strength for our soldiers and better health for civilians.
Now, I want to point out one more time, People that say, oh, socialism is bad, socialism is terrible, oh, blah, blah, blah. Keep in mind that this research that Dr. Keyes did, this was publicly funded, okay? This was publicly funded, and it started as public funding for the defense of the nation and for the military, and that then, similar to how the internet was developed, that was then utilized to create a diet that was then implemented by or for the betterment of public health.
Scientists at food plants, at universities, and at the Quartermaster Corps' own subsistence laboratories in Chicago study food for energy. The food weapons of our enemies are investigated. The Japanese are supposed to produce great fighting energy out of a handful of rice. This is the amount of rice one of our soldiers would have to eat to approach the energy in his own ration. The Nazis are supposed to have a Superman vitamin pill. The pill story is checked by Dr. Ancel Keyes and his staff at the University of Minnesota.
Now, I want to take note here. I want you to take note here. The problem is Dr. Keyes was not a big believer in vitamin supplementation. However, when I go over Dr. Bruce Ames, we're going to discover the importance of vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients and things of this nature in maintaining optimal health. Okay? This is a problem that you have to understand. A lot of people will find a health guru, whether it's Ancel Keyes or Dr. Atkins or John McDougall or Joel Furman. It really doesn't matter who the health guru is. But you shouldn't be looking at the guru. You should be looking at the science, and you should be looking at supporting science of different ideas, because there is supporting science for different ideas, and you want to make sure that you're getting a whole picture when you're talking about your health. And the reason why is it is your health. It's not somebody else's health, it's your health, which makes that important.
Vitamins and pills do not help pull weight, but vitamins do help the body use food. Only after eating actual food can a soldier pull more weight or push a bayonet harder. To discover what foods contain the right vitamins for fighting in various parts of the world, experiments are conducted in rooms where any climate can be imitated.
Holy smoke, they got us in the Sahara Desert.
In this heat, different foods are tried. What's lost in perspiration is measured. The answer to the vitamin question is not pills, but good food in plenty of variety, according to Dr. Keyes.
If vitamins were missing from his food, a soldier might have to take concentrated vitamins. If he had vitamins but no food, he would still starve. The best way, naturally, is to supply vitamins in the food.
It is for this reason that the Army uses only vitamin-enriched flour in its bread. So the Army has developed the now famous K ration, the completely streamlined meal. Originally designed for paratroops, K proved ideal for tank busters, commandos, and all isolated units. Each package contains a balanced vitamin-rich meal. A day's ration weighs about 2 pounds. K was developed under Colonel Rowland A. Isker.
The object of the K ration is to provide the soldier with food under emergency. This ration, with its variations, is therefore adapted to all climatic conditions, from the tropics to the frigid zone.
Each item in K had to be super nutritious, but also appetizing. So each item was tested by Colonel Isker's guinea pig lunch club. Several recipes, for instance, were tried in picking a soybean biscuit.
This biscuit seems to meet specifications. Pretty tasty biscuit. You bake this biscuit on existing equipment? With a few adjustments. How much soy is there in these? About 1 part in 7.
Good eating.
To discover which one of these three gentlemen is the real diet and health authority. So will the real Dr. Ancel Keys please stand up?
This is from Dr. Keys' own University of Minnesota School of Public Health. This is called Dr. Ancel Keys, A Brief Profile.
Warning. Of 10 men, we can expect 5 to get it. But we can't say who, or when, or why.
When the war ended, Ancel Keys turned his scientific curiosity toward the new American plague, as he called it, coronary heart disease.
The facts are simple. You know the chief killer of Americans is cardiovascular disease, disorders and degeneration of the heart and blood vessels. Here are vital statistics. They show that this problem here in America.
Keep in mind that heart disease is still, at least as far as I know, the #1 killer of U.S. men and women. That should be disturbing to people, especially because it is very preventable.
It's the worst in the world.
Keys was particularly struck by reports of the number of seemingly healthy executive men who were dropping dead of heart attacks. Was it job stress, as some suggested, or could it be something else? While it was understood by the mid-1940s that blocked coronary arteries caused heart attacks, no one understood the cause of the artery-blocking deposits. Dr. Keys proposed a study that would follow a large number of apparently healthy executives for many years, comparing the characteristics of those who had heart attacks along the way with those who didn't. It was the start of Keys' search for what later would be called risk factors for heart disease. During annual visits to the Laboratory of Physiological Hygiene, the executives received thorough testing and examination, sometimes on equipment designed and built right in the laboratory. A general interview assessed the men's lifestyles and changing habits.
Still like apples as much as ever?
Haven't got one in your pocket, have you, Doctor?
See you again next year.
Next year.
We hope.
Nice to see you again, Judge.
After 40 years of follow-up, 54 men out of 283 were still living. The most frequent cause of death, heart disease. The most common risk factor, smoking. Keys identified blood pressure and blood cholesterol as other risk factors that affected either the heart attack rates or the longevity of the executives. But even before this study began providing answers, Ancel Keys was thinking up more questions. This time, the research would be much larger in scope and objective. It was clear to Keys that a need was growing for a long-term, cross-cultural comparison of populations. Laboratory, clinical, and epidemiological findings all seemed to be pointing in the same direction. The time was ripe for a systematic study. So Keys prepared the design for an immense international collaboration, unlike any undertaken to date. He wrote the grants and lined up colleagues around the world to work with him. The project to study 12,000 healthy middle-aged men in 7 countries began.
Keep in mind the size and scope of this research. 12,000 individuals in 7 countries that began in 1958. That's a very large group of people.
In 1958. The diet in the Mediterranean countries centered on fruits and vegetables, bread and pasta, and plenty of olive oil. Meats, fish, and dairy products were used as condiments rather than as the focus of the meal. The diet in the
I want people to pay special attention to what this says about the diet in Mediterranean countries.
Mediterranean countries centered on fruits and vegetables, bread and pasta, and plenty of olive oil. The diet in the Mediterranean countries centered on fruits and vegetables, bread and pasta, and plenty of olive oil. Meats, fish, and dairy products were used as condiments rather than as the focus of the meal.
Meats, fish, and dairy products were used as condiments rather than the focus of the meals. So what you have to understand is, if you look at the diets, especially the blue zone diets that promote longevity, you will notice that common factor throughout all of them.
Finland was chosen for its high butterfat diet, the highest saturated fat diet of any country at the time. The Finns, in fact, were known to spread butter on their cheese. The Japanese were chosen for their remarkably low saturated fat diet. For consistency across countries, all participants came from rural areas or small communities. They ranged from men living in 2 Japanese villages to American and Italian railroad workers examined in railroad cars that served as field laboratories, to farmers and laborers in areas of Crete, Italy, Yugoslavia, and Finland. To standardize the findings, data from the 7 countries were sent back to the laboratory in Minnesota for analysis. Every 5 years, Keyes tallied up the number of people who had heart disease or had died of it in each country. The differences were dramatic.
Basically, there turned out to be from 5 to 10-fold differences in heart attack rate in men of this age between the Mediterranean basin, Northern Europe, US, and Japan, with Japanese and the Greek islanders having the lowest rates of all, Finland and the United States having highest, with parts of Yugoslavia, Northern Italy, and Holland in between. The 7-country study demonstrated clearly the preventability of heart attacks.
So this is from a YouTube channel called Plantbased, and I very strongly recommend people look at his primitive nutrition series. So I might just skim this because it is a little long, but I want people to look at this. I want people to also look at his the primitive response playlist, nutrition past and future, and the primitive nutrition series. This is a very interesting channel, very good. I strongly encourage people to check out this channel right here, Plantbased.
In order to demonstrate the reliability of the information and the quality of the reasoning you will find among the cholesterol confusionists, I'd like to focus on a favorite whipping boy of theirs, the great Ancel Keys. Ancel Keys was one of the most famous public health researchers of the 20th century. He pioneered several modern techniques in health and biology, including detailed comparisons of whole populations to determine the effects of different lifestyle factors on health. It was out of this research that he, more than anyone else, established the connection between saturated fat and coronary heart disease. This has made him persona non grata among the lovers of saturated fat. Google his name, and after a wiki entry and a biography page from the school where he worked, you will see a series of attacks on him from the...
One of the biggest problems with people that are obsessed with cholesterol, the reason people like this, is people love to hear very good things about their very bad habits and very bad things about things that they don't like very much. That's why you hear people say these horrible things. For example, sugar substitutes. People will say sugar substitutes are the worst poison in the world, but in reality, sugar substitutes are a good alternative to sugar that provides sweetness without calories. There is very little evidence that they're harmful. The only one that I'm aware of that causes any type of insulin response is sucralose, which is actually made from sugar, and sucralose, it causes an insulin response, but it's still calorically, it doesn't have any calories. So the point is, as long as you're eating that with like actual food, which would also cause an insulin response, keep in mind pretty much everything you eat, except for fat, most dietary fats don't cause much of an insulin response. But the fact is, if you eat protein, see, the thing is, I take branched chain amino acids. People will say branched chain amino acids cause an insulin response. So does eating a steak. So does eating a chicken breast. Okay? So it leads you to wonder, how much do these people, are they assuming the public doesn't understand basic health, and how, well, they might be right there. But my point is that you have to keep in mind that there are benefits and consequences to almost anything you eat, but the fact of the matter is you should be eating that which has more benefits and less consequences. With the cholesterol people, the people that love cholesterol and love saturated fat, it becomes very convenient to think that butter and steak and sausage and pepperoni and cheese and all this stuff, it's very convenient to think that these are healthy foods, but in reality, these are the foods that are more or less killing the population. As I say that, I want to make sure people understand I'm not a doctor, not a physician, not a DO, not an MD, not a nurse, not an LPN, not an RN, nothing like that.
Confusionist blogosphere. One source of noise in that echo chamber is Mark Sisson, who turned his primal analytical skills to keys and to saturated fat in this definitive guide. Calling it definitive would lead one to believe he is quite confident about the quality of his research. In targeting keys, Sisson has a distinct advantage in this debate because he has chosen an adversary who is dead. Before taking him on, he attempts to demonstrate how woefully misguided the world is about saturated fat by simply reporting the number of hits a Google search turned up for the phrase artery clogging saturated fat. He got 4,490 results. We are to take this to mean the internet is abuzz about how saturated fat clogs your arteries. Of all the research strategies one might choose, counting hits on Google has to be the laziest. Therefore, I'll give it a try too. My search for the false statement, saturated fat is good for you, turned up 129,000 hits, or nearly 29 times as many as Sisson's search. Feeling better about the internet's collective wisdom now, Mr. Sisson? I'm not. Notice the way he expresses himself in this blog. Doctors toe the company line. The public laps it up from birth. This is a
very common thing that's used, especially amongst the truther community. It's this idea, and this is the stuff that like Alex Jones used to promote a lot of his nonsense. So what you do is you promote this idea that there's a conspiracy against the public, that science is a conspiracy against the public, and then what happens is it allows people to justify believing untruths without looking at the data.
Tone for science writing, but this is just how bro scientists think. Apparently, Mark Sisson fancies himself to be an extraordinarily intelligent man. That must be quite a cross to bear. He goes on. It all started, of course, with the infamous Ancel Keys and his 7-country study. What does it refer to? If he means suspicions that saturated fat contributes to heart disease, and I do think that is what he means, he is definitively wrong. That did not start with the 7-country study. A link between fat and heart disease was suspected in the 1930s. These concerns planted the seed for Key's work years later.
Keep in mind, it actually started before that, with Ellen G. White and Dr. John Harvey Kellogg had presumed that high animal fat diets actually were, artery clogging and health destroying foods. However, the science was not there, as I've stated. With Dr. Kellogg, there was a bit of science, but the science of physiology had not really matured to the level that it did after Dr. Keys. But keep that in mind, that the concept, it goes back to the 1800s, that high amounts of dietary animal fat contribute to the destruction of health, in particular heart health.
Here is another source for this history. Keys first turned his attention to cholesterol and heart disease in 1948. He was not convinced there was a connection. He first made public his suspicion of the American high-fat diet in 1952. Notice he was not concerned about dietary cholesterol. The following year, he delivered a landmark speech blaming dietary fat for its contribution to heart disease, yet he did not believe it deserved full blame. This 1953 address and the paper associated with it are what Sisson is actually criticizing in his article, although he apparently doesn't understand that. The 7-country study was begun 5 years later, in 1958, to investigate Keyes' concerns. In 1961, Keyes first makes the distinction that...
So what you have to understand is that Dr. Keyes originally blamed all fats for the artery clogging issues before the 7-country study, which showed unequivocally that it was the saturated fats. And I want to be clear, a lot of people are eating a lot of coconut oil and palm oil and things like that. These are saturated fats too. These are artery clogging fats too. And they should not be eaten in large quantities either. Okay? And they're plant-based fats. But let's move on.
It is specifically saturated fat, and not dietary fat in general, that increases blood cholesterol. By 1964, it was a common belief that saturated fats contributed to heart disease. In 1968, it was shown that reducing saturated fat in the diet could lower risk factors for heart disease. And it is in 1970 that the 7-country study was first presented. So in his so-called definitive guide, Sisson doesn't even know which paper he's talking about. He thinks the 7-country study was named incorrectly because Keyes didn't use information for 22 countries. But he doesn't understand that that data about 22 countries relates to his 1953 paper, not the 7-country study. When he says it all started with the 7-country study, he is off by somewhere between 17 and 35 years or so, depending on which events you think he has in mind. And he fails to present the cautious and gradual development of Keyes' ideas leading to his concerns over saturated fat. All this while he has the temerity to call him infamous and present the medical world, in other words, people with proper training, as towing the company line. This is the shoddy, arrogant bro science of a shirtless supplement salesman and fad diet promoter. I'll show you how even this data on 22 countries on this graph is being abused. But first, let's take a moment to remember the man Sisson calls infamous. This was the man who created the K rations that fed American soldiers in World War II. He also led a one-of-a-kind starvation experiment using healthy volunteers so that Allied forces could better understand and manage the undernourished victims of the war once they were liberated. Keyes also introduced the idea of a Mediterranean diet to America, a nutritional model that has contributed far more to good health than any fad diet based on cavemen. Regrettably, the Mediterranean diet is falling out of favor today in its native lands, with meat consumption increasing and waistlines following suit. Did you notice on this slide that Keyes lived to 100? Even this accomplishment has been derided by the most small-minded of the low-carb fringe. Here's a blog post entitled Jack LaLanne vs. Ancel Keyes by fat and meat apologist Michael Eads. In his mind, there is something to be gained by casting a fitness legend and a science legend as opponents. At 93, LaLanne looked fantastic. And at 100, Keyes looked, well, he looked 100. Eads wants us to choose who we would rather look like in old age. You stay classy, Dr. Eads. I guess when you're the physical specimen Dr. Eads is, you have a right to judge the appearance of centenarians. I wonder if Eads ever shared his fitness tips with Jack LaLanne. Keyes' longevity is annoying to Eads. Read this slide and you'll see Mark Sisson is not the only one saying Ancel Keyes cast a 40-year-long Jedi mind trick.
Keep in mind also that Jack LaLanne's fitness journey started with him going as a strict vegetarian, what is today called a vegan, which was inspired by Paul Bragg. Keep that in mind. People will remember that from my series on Jack LaLanne.
The medical establishment. Eads wants to associate himself with Jack LaLanne. Since their connection is not immediately obvious, he provides a link to an old video of Lelaine talking about diet. The video is mostly about sugar, but at the end, Lelaine does say you should try to eat a lot of protein for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Eads like this advice about protein, of course. He will be disappointed to learn that Lelaine did not maintain a special focus on protein for the rest of his life. Lelaine spent years as a strict vegetarian. His protein fixation in the video was nothing more than the product of the conventional wisdom of the time. While he did eat fish and egg whites, he abstained from other meats and dairy throughout his later years. He made up the difference with lots and lots of fruits and vegetables. This, along with his fitness regimen, explains his great health into old age. If the esteemed Dr. Eads did not limit his research to watching a single YouTube video, he might have learned that he did not share a lot with Jack LaLanne. And he would have found that Keyes himself was hardly a radical. Keyes only advocated eating less meat, eggs, and dairy, and encouraged the consumption of other animal products. He considered fruits and vegetables to be merely supplemental. Consequently, his cholesterol score of 209 would be considered borderline high today. It seems to me Dr. Eads has more in common with Keyes than Jack LaLanne. Back to the bro scientist Mark Sisson. After his mangling of history, he next repeats a critique of Keyes that you will find all over the internet. He references original evidence about 22 countries that would have demolished the substance of Keyes' paper, which again is based on his speech in 1953, not the 7 countries study. His additional red dots on the graph's right side represent some primitive populations, 2 of which I have already addressed in the Primitive Nutrition series. You know the real story on those cultures now. Do you think he bothered to research those? You will notice Sisson has shifted from saturated fat to fat in general. Did he notice himself just do that? Sisson dares us in his swaggering bro-sciencey style to draw a line through the points in this irrelevant graph. He then makes the trite observation that an epidemiological study demonstrates correlation and not causation. No one says correlation equals causation, much less that a single epidemiological study can make an airtight case for causation, including the 7 countries study, which again is not what Sisson is referring to. Realize the 7 countries study was the first of its kind, so it was not as refined as similar studies that followed. It was flawed enough that it couldn't even turn up a connection between smoking and heart disease. But back to Sisson's graph. Really, he's just parroting a bogus critique that you will see all over the internet from confused Confucianists. As best I can tell, this material originates with Dr. Uffe Ravenskoff. He also develops this critique further than Sisson, so I will shift attention now to his book, The Cholesterol Myths. Like all cholesterol skeptics, Ravenskoff comes across as quite old-fashioned. He seems to think atherosclerosis just happens to arteries with age after a lifetime of stressful blood flow. For unknown reasons, he unhelpfully informs us, some people are unlucky enough to develop irregular plaques. To me, this sounds a lot like this text from 1908, attributing heart disease to mysterious variations in vital rubber. I also included some material here about moderate smoking being safe to emphasize the obsolescence of this publication. On this page you can see why I'm more interested in Ravenskoff's writing than Sisson's. He at least manages to get a date right, and he seems to be aware of the Mediterranean diet idea. But he too relies on inflammatory language. His odd phrase in the 3rd line from the bottom, "The Americans are inferior to other countries," suggests he is fumbling for an emotional hot button in his readers to press.
What I want people to understand here, too, is the 7 countries study, which was very good science, might appear to be problematic if it was not confirmed subsequently again and again and again by both epidemiological studies as well as clinical research, as well as looking for mechanisms of action, as well as further studies looking at different key ingredients of the Mediterranean diets, phytonutrients, monounsaturated fat, and looking at the effects of cholesterol and stuff in, again, epidemiological studies and clinical studies and mechanistic studies. So the thing is, the whole concept of the 7 countries research has been fairly nothing but confirmed again and again and again and again and again and again and again, unless you're looking for crazy oddball studies that don't really mean very much, and a lot of times are not structured very well. But if you look at large meta-analyses and things like that, you're going to find out that the findings of the 7 country study are confirmed again and again and again. The Mediterranean diet's health promoting benefits are confirmed again and again and again and again, just like the Okinawan diet's health promoting benefits are confirmed again and again and again and again. Okay, and that's what you need to understand. Now, I'm going to move on real quick. Okay, this chick's name is Samantha, and I thought it would be very nice just to share her videos, and she doesn't seem to make many videos anymore. Most of these are from about a year ago, but her videos are very nice, and they promote the Mediterranean diet, and I thought it would be nice to include one of her videos, maybe get some traffic over to her channel. And I'll start now.
I'm Samantha, I'm a registered dietitian, and welcome to my channel. So today we will be discussing something that I'm very passionate about, which is the Mediterranean diet, and we'll be talking about Ancel Keys and the 7 countries study. So let's get started.
Notice that unlike carnivore dieters, she leaves links to her references in the description of her video. That's very beneficial. This will be in my playlist on Ancel Keys, and I encourage people to watch the playlist and to do more research on Ancel Keys and more research on the Mediterranean diet, and do their own research.
Ancel Keys was an American scientist who went on to conduct the 7 countries study, and he was the first one to notice a link between diet and coronary heart disease. Ancel Keys was born to teenagers in 1904, and he grew up in Berkeley, California, where his family struggled. In 1922, he started at the University of California at Berkeley, and he completed his undergraduate degree in just 2 years. He returned to UC Berkeley and earned his first PhD in biology in 1930. After a 2-year fellowship in Copenhagen working under August Crow, he went on to study at the University of Cambridge, earning his second PhD in biology in 1936. From here, Keys pioneered work on the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. In 1939, he was recruited to the University of Minnesota, where he would stay until his retirement in 1975. His next major study was the controversial but groundbreaking Minnesota starvation experiment, which studied the best way to safely and gradually refeed starving refugees. In the 1950s, he began the landmark 7 country study, which we will detail today. So the 7 country study was started by Ancel Keys in 1958, and the first phase of the study lasted until 1983. Keys had noticed that the poor populations in small towns of southern Italy were much healthier than the wealthier citizens of New York. Keys suggested that this depended on...
This is also similar to the China study that studied rural Chinese. So let's continue.
And so started the 7 country study. So Keys hypothesized that diet and lifestyle influenced the development of heart disease, which challenged the common medical wisdom at the time that atherosclerosis was a natural consequence of aging. The study measured dietary habits, biomarkers, and lifestyles of over 12,000 men in 7 countries: the US, Italy, Finland, Greece, the Netherlands, Japan, and Yugoslavia. The 7 country study was a prospective cohort study, which means that the researchers enrolled participants who did not have coronary heart disease at baseline, and they continued to track and collect data on these participants over time. The researchers then assessed incidence of and mortality from coronary heart disease and tracked whether baseline measurements were associated with differing propensities for disease development and mortality. The study was observational, meaning the researchers did not introduce dietary or lifestyle interventions. So what were the findings of the 7-country study? Well, the study found 3 significant correlations. Number 1, that saturated fat intake is correlated to serum cholesterol levels. The cohorts with the highest intake of calories from saturated fat had also high serum cholesterol levels, and cohorts with low intake of calories from saturated fat had also low serum cholesterol levels. Number 2, that saturated fat intake is correlated to incidence of coronary heart disease. And number 3, that serum cholesterol levels are correlated to incidence of coronary heart disease. The study at the time did not prove a causation among these factors, but through subsequent studies and findings, we can now state with confidence that a causation does in fact exist. Or in other words, that saturated fat intake can raise cholesterol levels, which can lead to coronary heart disease. So what is the Mediterranean diet? Well, we can first go to Ancel Keys himself, who described the diet in this way. Homemade minestrone, pasta of all varieties, with tomato sauce and a sprinkling of Parmesan, only occasionally enriched with a few pieces of meat or served with a small fish of the place, beans, and macaroni. So much bread, never removed from the oven more than a few hours before being eaten. Lots of fresh vegetables sprinkled with olive oil, a small portion of meat or fish, maybe a couple times a week, and always fresh fruit for dessert. The Mediterranean diet is not a diet per se, but it's more so a lifestyle and dietary pattern. It's a term that's used to describe the way of eating that reflects the countries that surround the Mediterranean Sea, such as those studied by Ancel Keys. In general, these populations tend to eat largely whole food plant-based with plenty of whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, extra virgin olive oil, with moderate amounts of fish and seafood, dairy products, eggs, and poultry, and very little red meat and sweets. During his studies, Ancel Keys had become so convinced of the health benefits of the Mediterranean diet that he chose to adopt it. He moved to Piopi, a small town in Italy, and ate like the natives until his death in 2004 at the age of 100. On his 100th birthday, he was asked whether his diet has contributed to his long life, and he answered, very likely, but no proof. So he was a very rigorous scientist. So what are our takeaways for today from Ancel Keys and the 7-country study? Well, Keys' practical recommendations on diet remain very much valid today. In fact, U.S. News & World Report recently ranked the Mediterranean diet as the #1 best diet overall. It was also #1 best plant-based diet, best heart-healthy diet, best diet for healthy eating, and easiest diet to follow. And it also ranked #1, tied for first, as best diabetes diet. Since the 7-country study, the Mediterranean diet continues to be studied, and Keys' original findings continue to be validated and also enriched. Aside from all its heart-healthy findings, we now know that the Mediterranean diet is linked to longevity, lower risk for cancer death, lower rates of cognitive decline, it's protective against type 2 diabetes, and it also supports a healthy gut microbiota. What's so great about the Mediterranean diet is that it's practical, it's simple, imaginative, and creative, and it's delicious. And in my professional opinion, most, if not all people, could benefit from moving towards this way of eating. It's not a diet in the restrictive sense, as nothing is completely off limits. And I think Michael Pollan, who's the author of The Omnivore's Dilemma, said it best when he said, "Eat food, not too much, mostly plants." Thank you so much for watching my very first video. Please hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more, give a thumbs up, leave a comment, and share, and I hope to see you in my next video.